Hello and welcome. Unfortunately, I have two bad news for you. I'm not in the greatest shape as of now, so we might have to cut short the Q&A, or it might even not happen today. And the other news is there's a little boy in need of love here, which is going to try to sabotage it, but we are going to try to make it as good as we can without him interfering. So today we are going to talk about the Lyman cauldron, what happened there, about Putin's speech that was about the annexation, and about more informations coming from the about the mobilization. So let's dive right in, and hello and welcome. Good. The little boy takes his place. So on the 30th of September, Putin has announced the annexation of the occupied territories of Ukraine. But the important part was he did not explicitly say where the borders will be. That means it was not said whether the annexation will just end where basically Russia is currently occupying, or whether they will be in the full extent of the oblast as they are by Ukrainian administration structure. This will allow Russia and Putin, if need be, to give in some negotiations. So it might actually be a kind of deliberate that it's done this way. And Petrov, I think was his name. No, I forgot it now. So his speaker actually confirmed that only the oblasts that were formerly Donetsk and Luhansk, which are the so-called People's Republic, are defined in their size as being annexed. The others are still to be determined. In his speech, he said that he asked, or he demanded from Kiev to return to the negotiating table from Ukraine. But at the same time, he insisted that no matter where the negotiations go, he will respect the wish of the people in those four oblasts, which means he will respect their wish to be annexed in the so-called referendums that he held there, which were obviously farce and completely non-legitimate. Meaning, wherever the negotiations will lead from now on, Russia, at least as of now, will not give in the point in giving up anything that it is currently occupied and basically annexed. He also he also issued various nuclear threats. But the important part is, while he tried to justify, basically call the others, the guys who did it first, he mentioned Nagasaki and Hiroshima. He mentioned the British bombing German cities, all meant to frighten the Soviets. While he basically issued his nuclear threats again, what he did not do, and that is the important part, he did not threaten Kiev directly in combination with the counteroffensive. So there he has not moved himself in a corner where he would lose face in case he doesn't do anything. But at the same time, he obviously keeps his options open. But at the same time, this is obviously good news, because that means if Ukraine, or when Ukraine's counteroffensive continues, there is not the threat of an immediate nuclear retaliation openly issued. From the north, we have further informations. So the GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence, has said that Belarus is preparing space for 20,000 soldiers, which is highly likely that it's going to host Russian soldiers. As of now, it seems more likely that they will just be sent there to be supplied and trained than to create a new front, a new offensive. The Ukrainian military itself says there is no indication whatsoever as of now that Russia is preparing new spearheads, new attack formations inside of Belarus for a further attack towards Kiev or maybe somewhere to the west. Obviously, that can change over time, but the recon satellites and the information the allies of Ukraine can gather should help Ukraine have the warning of probably several weeks should Russia come to the point that it's going to try to advance again. Ukraine itself was asking for a fast pass into NATO, and it's here discussed in the German state television, more or less. And it says like the Baltikum is in favor of it, but Germany is hesitant. But it also says so are basically the United States are also skeptical. So while there might be some interest in it and might be some support, I would say it's absolutely impossible. Not only is it contradicting paragraph 10 of NATO, which says that every new member must improve the security or at least not endanger the security of the alliance. Taking a state, a nation into the alliance, which is currently at war with a neighboring country, and that neighboring country, in this case, even being Russia, seems completely out of the question. So I would not expect Ukraine to go any further there until the war is lost or won, or in this case, probably until the war is won for Ukraine. It seems highly unlikely. From the eastern frontier, we have reports of a convoy with civilians between Svatove and Kupiansk, which was attacked. Right now, as of now, it is unclear who was the one attacking it. I have not seen anyone like any further information about that. The information I have is from the Ukrainian military. It is showing some civilian death, which I obviously, for obvious reason, am not going to show you. But the important thing is, I, as of now, was not able to determine in which direction that convoy was even supposed to go. So I'm going to make some people watching here fairly unhappy by saying, to me, it's undecided yet who actually did the killing. Now, this seems to be a convoy, a couple of cars, and in this war, increasingly on both sides, there are civilian cars in usage. We've seen that from the so-called People's Militias, the People's Republics. Their military force is using regular military cars, vehicles, trucks, whatever, but they're also using civilian cars. We've seen that from the Ukrainian side as well. So if a concentration of cars is driving with a fairly high speed, it is quite well within the realm of possibility that one side accidentally shot at them, expecting the other side to attack them. We personally, as Germans, did have an experience close to that in Afghanistan when German troops were in heavy battle. The Afghan police tried to come to aid, and the German troops were not able to recognize that it was Afghan police, opened fire and killed the Afghan policemen inside of their car. So something like this is well within the realms of possibility inside of a war. So in this case, I will not come to the point and just swallow the Ukrainian claims. It's quite possible that the Russians did it, but at this point, to be perfectly honest and objective, we have to say there is still a possibility that those people were killed by the Ukrainians as well, obviously in mistake. I'm not going to claim that the Ukrainians did try to kill some of their own civilians on purpose, but things like that actually happen in war, that by mistake you misidentify and kill innocent civilians. As of now, it seems highly likely that the Ukrainians conquered Petropavlivka. Now in the latest map updates, it's now in the gray. Before, I think it was still red. The Ukrainian general staff was at least implying it as they reported Russian attacks on Petropavlivka, which would be at least a hint that it's probably in Ukrainian hands. Otherwise, the Russians wouldn't attack there. The Ukrainian troops were the latest reports, like from 30 hours more or less ago, were that the Ukrainian troops had closed the cauldron around Liman, and there was to be expected a battle for probably a couple of days, maybe a week or two, to reduce the Russian troops there. The first rumors were 3,000 men. I've read claims up to 5,000 Russian soldiers being encircled there, but as of now, it is absolutely clear that the majority of those troops actually got away. There are also some claims on the internet about hundreds, even thousands of Russian dead while fleeing the cauldron, while fleeing from Liman, but I have yet to see anything close to that in proof. There are some pictures, some videos of claimed destruction from Russian forces fleeing from Liman, but it's nowhere close to what is actually claimed. Excuse me, but my throat is really dry. So what we can say now is that Dobrysheve and Yampil were under Ukrainian control. According to the Russians, they withdrew their troops to Liman. But as we can see now, it seems that the majority of the Russian troops actually managed to get away. In the afternoon today here in Panama, it was still unclear whether Liman was completely occupied yet or whether there was still some remnants left unsecured. But as of now, the information is that Liman is completely in Ukrainian hands. I have not seen big reports about captured equipment. I have not seen big reports about captured soldiers. So we can expect that the majority actually more or less got away here. This, on the other hand, asks the question how. 2 days ago in the status report, I reported that according to Russian sources, Torske was threatened, maybe even taken. Days before, the pro-Russian channels reported sabotage troops there, which should at least have hindered the further supply lines, the lines of communication there. But there we might actually have fallen, or I might have actually fallen into a trap of the Russian propaganda in this case, because in general it can be said it's more trustworthy to believe the side that is admitting defeat than the side that is claiming success. Now, this might be an interesting case where for once it might be different, because in this case it might be possible that the cauldron that was about to happen, I mean, I was talking about it for 2 weeks, that the bloggers saw it. The pro-Russian Telegram bloggers saw it, expected it to happen, and tried to prevent it by making the situation of the potential encirclement more dramatic than it actually was, to force the opinion from the Kremlin downwards to make those troops withdraw from Lyman. That is at least one possibility of that. If we have already heard the Ukrainians reaching Zarichne and Torske like a day or two ago, while the majority of the troops have still gotten away. And as it seems of now, I have not seen big amounts of captured equipment, so that we have a couple of thousands running through the woods and getting away seems not to have happened. So whatever the reason was there was obviously some exaggeration on one side. The Russians must have had a way out, and they must have taken it more or less in time when it was about to be needed. They might have suffered some losses, but the majority of those troops seems to be likely that they have actually gotten out. For me, the question was, why would they even fight for Lyman, especially after the reports were that Lyman is now encircled? The only thing to imagine would have been that the troops there were considered to be expendable. It was mostly BAR, so raised reserves. Maybe they were considered to be more expendable, and to buy time basically for the rest of the reinforcements to build a new defensive line. But as we see now, it was because I didn't see that big of a strategic target that justifies fighting to the last man in Liman. But as we see now, apparently the majority of them actually got out. Further east, we have further Russian attacks close to Soledar and Bakhmutske being reported. Further attacks in Mykolaiivka Druha, Odradivka, Salince, Mayorsk, and Zaitsevo. All of this basically from this line down here, attacks and attacks. The Ukrainians claim more or less they defeated every single one of them. The Russians themselves claim they actually gained further ground in Bakhmut, which should be on the eastern side of the river here, where we already had some unconfirmed reports that they might have entered Bakhmut from the east here. So if the Russians are true in this case, we can expect them to have gained a few blocks within the city here, which is far from being impossible. Further south, the Ukrainians are reporting further attacks around Avdiivka. Here again, Avdiivka is one of the strong points, heavily fortified. It's not usually not frontally attacked. The Russians are basically trying to do the same as the Ukrainians did with Liman. They try to more or less bypass it and threaten it with encirclement. But since last weeks, for weeks basically, there is no advances at all in this region being reported. Further south, we don't have any further real reports here, and along the southern fronts, we don't have any reports about serious military fighting. Obviously, artillery fighting is along the whole front line, more or less more dominant from the Russian side, but we can expect the Ukrainian side to respond in kind. Now here we have the next thing, the next civilian convoy that was attacked. The latest number I had was 28 civilians dead and 88 wounded. There were unconfirmed. I have not seen it since the German stream. Maybe there are a few new updates that I have missed by now, but there were somewhat confronting reports at least. One was claiming it was close to Zaporizhzhia, to the city here, and one was saying they were waiting to be passed through the checkpoint. This is, as I said in the past, a very weird war in some regards. I can't remember having heard about much wars with more or less stable front lines where you have checkpoints so civilians or neutrals can go from one side to the front to the other one. But here, for whatever reason, this is actually the case. Here close to Vasilivka, so probably here, is a checkpoint where civilians can, through some processing, switch over from one side to the other. And while one report was claiming that the attack on the civilian convoy was close to the city of Zaporizhzhia, this one was that they were waiting here in line and were attacked there. Now, if the second is the case, there could be some small chance of a misunderstanding happening here. Again, if they weren't actually standing, I mean, I did not see the impact. In theory, they might have still been driving. There might be somebody afraid that it's pushing towards the front. If it's here though, so there is a slight chance of it being misidentified as some kind of improvised civilian convoy, maybe with the Foreign Legion in it or something like this. But more or less, if they were actually standing here in front of the checkpoint, then it would actually be an attack on civilians for whatever reason, which unfortunately, or which I can't really explain, because while the Russians have not been hesitant to create civilian deaths, to risk them, there are not that, like the deliberate killing with artillery on purely civilian targets among this is still kind of like, I try to find a military reasoning in a lot of the attacks. And if you attack a besieged town, you might find some justification in this. But a group of civilians in civilian cars being attacked is still more or less hard to grasp for me. So while, to summarize, while there's a serious chance of the convoy between Kupiansk and Svatove being actually friendly fire or misidentified, actually the Ukrainians might still turn out that the Ukrainians might have been responsible there by mistake. The thing here in the south is far less unlikely here. It's far more unlikely that the Ukrainians might have done it themselves. Depending on where it is. Obviously, if it was at Zaporizhzhia, it's absolutely, it doesn't make any sense why the Ukrainians would have done it. Waiting here at the checkpoint also seems extremely unlikely, but with the Russian side. So in this regard, I know I'm talking a little too long about this topic now. I try to be objective, and the thing is, about those attacks, we only have usually Ukrainian reports, and in some cases it's obvious, in some cases it isn't. Here I wouldn't say it's completely obvious, but it's highly leaning towards the Russians being responsible here, whereas in Kupiansk, Svatove, there might be some way that it's actually has been a case of misidentification. Furthermore, the Russians have abducted the boss of the Zaporizhzhia power plant. Whatever the reason is, whatever the reason is for that, I can't really say. We can obviously guess now that maybe he knows who has proof who shot at the power plant or something like this. But this is pure guesswork, so I'll try not to dive into that speculation here. From Kherson, we have further. We still have some kind of problem because the Ukrainians keep up their operational silence. In this front line, there are hardly any reports from the Ukrainian side when it comes about serious military activity. But for the last few days, this is more or less in line with what the Russian says. The Ukrainians are still pounding logistics, communication lines, command structures, and strong points. That much is unchanged. But at the same time, we have Ukrainian side claiming that there are 2,000 freshly mobilized soldiers from the Crimea that have arrived on the right bank of the Dnieper. And the Ukrainians said the focus of the mobilization had been on the Crimean Tatars. They are supposed to be sent to where the intensity of the fighting is the highest, which would imply that the Russians are going to try to put them where it's most likely to die. Now, this has to be put into some perspective again. As I say almost every episode here, Ukraine is an active war participant, and as such, it has an interest to shape the field, the informational battlefield as well. They are interested to at least do some framing. And if you want to be mean, you can even say they have some interest in actually bending the truth where it's necessary, where it suits them. So whenever the Ukrainians claim that, we should not take it as a fact, but we obviously shouldn't take the Russian side as a fact either. But what we can say, if this is true and there is some credibility to it, then this would indicate what the Russians are doing, where we have more or less proof of, that they focus their mobilization on ethnic minorities. Now, this should not be called an ethnic minority, because that would kind of imply that it is that we accept Crimea as being annexed. Crimean Tatars, if at all, they are an ethnic minority within Ukraine, not within Russia. But the Crimean Tatars are a people that have been prosecuted by the Soviet Union. They have been deported to Central Asia. On the way to the deportation, thousands, tens of thousands of them, I don't remember the exact number, but a huge amount of them died during the deportation. They were not allowed back for decades. And since they were allowed back, they are more or less generally considered, at least to my knowledge, as being fair, as being loyal to the Kiev government, to Ukraine, as they see Ukraine as some kind of protector from the Russians. Now, the Crimean Tatars here are thus a minority that is fiercely loyal, at least expected from what I've read. I might be mistaken here, but my knowledge is that they are more or less fiercely loyal to Ukraine, and they seem to be chosen here as cannon fodder to be basically used up to spare Russian recruits, and at the same time as like a win-win situation for Russia's racial war, to use them up and reduce the amount of ethnic minorities, as the Russians are doing it with the Dagestanis, with the Buryats, with the Tuvans. As we can see from all out of Russia, they seem to do the same here. The Russians, we further have knowledge from Kherson. There are reports that the Russians are requisiting, I think is the word, civilian houses to house soldiers, which implies another strengthening of the Russian forces on the right side of the Dnieper. And the last information I have generally about Kherson is that the deputy head of the occupation administration, Alexei Katerinchev, was killed in an attack in Kherson. From my understanding, it was with HIMARS. He was taken out. In the north of the battlefield itself, we have reports about battles and artillery, but no territorial change. In the center at the Inholets bridgehead, we have the same battles without big changes and artillery. There's another report about Bezimene that was attacked and that the Ukrainians defeated it. And thanks to some commentators, I learned that there is actually, again, another town named with the same name. So while I always was wondering why the Ukrainians are here, while they were supposedly still fighting for Snihurivka, there's actually another Bezimene more or less exactly here. And that's obviously the point where all the fighting is all the time, where it makes perfect sense to expect that the Ukrainians are here in the Inholets bridgehead and not further to the west. So there's also fighting here, and Ukraine is also saying they attacked a drone ground station in Davydiv Brit here. This time they did not report any casualties, and they didn't, at least I didn't see any, and I didn't see any claims that this time they killed Iranian trainers as well. So they might have just attacked a regular ground station. But again, it kind of makes sense as the Iranian drones have limited range. And if you want to communicate them, it's probably the only way is by direct line of sight. So the further you are to the enemy, the further the range and the further the possibility to communicate with the drones. In the south, we have reports that Ukrainian forces claim, the Ukrainian General Staff is saying Ternovi Pole was attacked by the Russians, which only makes sense if it's in Ukrainian hands, so it might have been taken by the Ukrainians. And this was what I have from this area, and we can take some conclusions from what we are hearing here. We have fresh reports about further reinforcements of the Russians on the right side of the Dnieper. Now, this teaches us a few things. First of all is, unless we could expect the Russians to be utterly incompetent, which is an easy way out, but highly unlikely, because you don't send additional troops to an area where you already thin on supplies. If you send fresh ones, then at least you take other ones out. But we still have reports of the Russian pouring in reinforcements. We hear that every couple of days, which would be an indication that the Russians, despite the attacks on the bridges, despite the destruction of them, despite the attacks on the barges, on the ferries, despite all of this, the Russians are actually still getting in enough supplies that they can actually even increase their forces there. Now, if we assume this, and not just pure incompetence of the Russian in feeding additional troops into a logistical nightmare, if we accept the second option as the more likely ones, that the Russians actually bring enough supplies, that would explain why the Ukrainians more or less seem to have stopped the big attacks along the front line. My assumption on this front line was that the Ukrainians, by destroying the bridges, were developing and starting an intentional attritional battle. We heard about months that the Russians were building fortifications along the whole front line here, fortifications in depth with pre-prepared bunkers being shipped there. So it must be a really strong defensive line there. To run into that head front is highly bloody. So the smarter way seemed to be to reduce the amount of supplies that are being shipped on the right side of the river while increasing the usage of supply by the Russians. And the only way to make sure the Russians use more supplies is to engage them in battle and force them to fire at you, more or less. That is obviously an attritional battle, so the Ukrainian side has to accept higher losses, unnecessary losses if you don't achieve anything with that. And that's probably the point here, because if everything goes to plan, the supply usage will be significantly higher than the supplies being able to be shipped there. At some point, obviously, the depots are empty, and from then on, the fighting power is shrinking despite the number of troops in there, which would then allow the Ukrainians to push the Russians back and take the territory down to the Dnieper. Now, if the Russians are still able to get enough supplies in, enough actually that they increase their forces, then there's no point in continuing an attritional battle. The attritional battle is not just to kill men. The Ukrainians don't want to exchange one soldier of theirs against one of the Russians. In the end, the Russians have the bigger people, and Ukraine has a democratic government that has to justify its losses towards its own population. So there can't be any interest in the Ukrainians to do something like this. If not, at the very least, it is offering a valuable target that is going to be achieved by that. And Kherson would be such a target, but only if they can actually reach it with these tactics. And as my interpretation of the informations we get, which is that the Russians are reinforcing their position there, that would indicate me that it's highly likely that the Russians actually get enough supply in, and then the whole attritional battle is pointless, which would now explain why we more or less don't hear anything big anymore along the whole front line for probably 2 weeks now. Now, you would continue reconnaissance attacks, you would continue fixing attacks, because especially with the Ukrainians having the strategic initiative, they don't want the Russians to pull out troops here to send them either to Donbass or towards Luhansk, Kharkiv. So they need to fix them there in place, and you can only do that by showing activity as well. But the intensity of the fighting seems to have gone down significantly. At least that's somewhat indicated to a degree here. So we would expect this to be the reason for that. The that was more or less here what we see. Otherwise, we can see that the Donbass, this fighting is still more or less pointless. The Russians are not really advancing a lot. Now, they might have entered Bakhmut, so we can see whether they're actually going to try fighting through the town and not just bypassing it and threatening it with encirclement, which would have been my expectation here. But I guess we'll see that over the coming weeks, because I have not seen yet Ukrainian comments on the Russians having entered Bakhmut, and I can't remember seeing any visual proof. So that might just be fog of war here, or they might actually be in there. I'm not going to say that they are probably not in there. It's just not unclear. When we come to this area, we see the Ukrainians now having taken out Liman, having taken that transport hub here. They will likely try to advance further east, probably Svatove to cut this transport hub, preventing both supplies down to Severodonetsk and to Starobilsk. But we can see how far further they can actually advance east, because the further they go, the longer their front line becomes. And that's one of the big issues here, as they might push the Russians out, but they basically have to defend the whole front line, the whole international border once they've reached it. So taking the east here might be a juicy target. It might even be possible, but from a military standpoint, I don't see a big point in that. But there we might see actually a clash of military and political leadership, as we've seen with the Russians, where Putin supposedly ordered the military to not give up the right bank of the Dnieper. Because from a military standpoint, it might make sense to maybe go somewhere here, widen it a little, and then swing down towards Luhansk, instead of creating an extension of the front line, extend the front line, forcing yourself to spread yourself thinner to defend everything, doesn't seem to make too much sense. But so from a military standpoint, trying to reach the Russian border here doesn't seem to make sense. From a political standpoint, that's a whole different story, though, as we've seen the reports of the torture chambers in a lot of the liberated towns. To justify it as a precedent that Ukraine left Bilovodsk occupied by the Russians for another half year, another year, when they could have liberated it, and finding out later that Ukrainian citizens were tortured and killed during that time, who could have been liberated in the meantime, will definitely put pressure on Zelensky to order the troops to try to reach the international border as soon as they can to liberate everyone here, while from a military standpoint, it doesn't seem to make too much sense advancing further to the east here. But we will see how far it'll go here. That's more or less the military situation. When it comes to total, we can say the strategic initiative is clearly still on the Ukrainian side. On Crimea, we have some reports. Now, there's just recently, a few hours ago, there were explosions in the airport at Belbek, but that was apparently just a plane that crashed either before landing or after start. So maybe some more mistakes from the maintenance part or something. There have been recently a lot of crashes within the Russian Air Force, but it seems fairly clear that it was not a Ukrainian attack. What we have from Crimea, though, is that the Ukrainian says the majority of the Shahed 136 usage is starting from Crimea, and they admitted they have trouble finding them in time, seeing them in time, because they supposedly fly fairly low. Which is kind of surprising to me, to be honest, because the videos I've seen from them flying seem to be showing them flying in like 200 meters altitude, which in itself probably would make some sense if there's a constant communication with the drone from its control center, as they don't work with satellite communication, at least as far as we know, so it has to go online on site. So the further it goes away from the ground station, the higher the drone has to fly. Now, I hope at some point the Ukrainians are going to capture one in a good shape and will be able to read the software on it, the navigation software. In theory, if the programming is complicated enough, it might take the GPS data, which it clearly has, as it seems to be using commercial components, including GPS, which it uses for targeting. That should, in theory, allow it to follow the Earth basically in some the increases in altitude and decreases according to the topography. but whether they actually programmed that into it is a whole different story. And at least the visual evidence we have from the Shahid 136 usage does not imply that. So despite them claiming to have issue identifying them, they said since the 10th of September, they shot down 27. And between the 25th and the 29th alone, they said there were 29 uses of the drones, which both indicates to us that how many of them are currently available to the Russians, that they can use more or less like 7 to 10 per day. Regarding that within 20 days they shot down 30 means that a lot still got through. Now that was it, what we have here directly from the battlefield. We have more news about the mobilization. Putin is now admitting the chaos that is happening. The Speaker of the Duma, the Russian parliament, Vyacheslav Volodin, has said that Russian with military registration, whatever that's supposed to mean, are not allowed to leave their home without permission by the recruiting offices. Later that was refuted. What's the word? Like, it was said that this isn't true. That wasn't correct. And this is just one part of the complete chaos that is currently unfolding. Sorry. That's just one of the indication of the complete chaos that is unfolding in what Russia is calling partial mobilization. It shows how immense the institutional weakness is within the Russian armed forces when it comes to its military organization. We have to see here that we're talking about armed forces that were supposed to mobilize to several million men to fight NATO, and currently they're struggling getting just a few 100,000 officially properly recruited. CIA Director William Burns was saying that Russia, according to the CIA, Russia will not be able to train 300,000 additional men, to equip them properly and to logistically supply them. But if you are watching this channel, then at least apart from the logistical part, you knew that a few weeks ago already. There are further reports about new mobilized soldiers already in Kharkiv Oblast. Some of them are already captured. Others have reported that they were already sent to the front line. We have from within Russia, we have further reports of protests, and some, including some arson attacks on recruitment offices. Some of them were prevented, and the would-be arsonists were arrested. Russian sources are claiming that the people running the Telegram channels that were asking the people to protest are now getting arrested, as well as that the people who were organizing the protest in Dagestan have been forced to publicly apologize for what they did by inciting basically protests. We have information that on the border to Kazakhstan, this is now a German translation of the Russian article, they set up a mobile recruiting point. At this point, I can't really confirm yet what this is supposed to mean. We hear conflicting stories about it, more or less from one side or the other. So supposedly either they are forcing people who want to leave to join the armed forces, or they are trying to convince them to join, basically force people to go through that recruiting post before they are being let out of the country, appealing to their patriotism or something like this, or that they are just checking the people that are on some lists to be recruited, so at least those don't leave the country as of now. All of this, though, is not really clear what exactly is happening there, but again, it shows the complete chaos that the oblasts, the regions within Russia, have not received some predefined list by the Ministry of Defense that states the names of the individual soldiers that are to be called up, but it's just telling the regions, you have to recruit us 5,000 men until then and then. That's more or less it. Seems to be more or less it, how the mobilization is currently working. Because of this, Israel has now asked its citizens that also hold Russian citizenship every one of those who has military experience to leave Russia immediately to prevent them from being recruited into the Russian armed forces. Obviously, that means both military experience can both include Russian within the Russian military as well as the Israeli military, as there is some threat that the Russians might recruit dual citizens as well. The Ukrainian General Staff is saying Russians are arresting people in Kherson and force them to join Russian units that are about to leave to the front line. Again, Ukrainian General Staff, we have no way of confirming what they're saying, and the Ukrainian General Staff has a vested interest in framing the whole situation according to Ukrainian interests. The same we hear about Mariupol. There, the Ukrainian mayor, who obviously has fled Mariupol quite some time ago, is saying Russian military personnel is patrolling more or less the city, and whenever they find a man, they check where his papers and if he was born in the Oblast of Donetsk. And we're not just talking about like the so-called People's Republic, but everything, everywhere within the whole Oblast, they supposedly take him and send him directly to DNR units along the front line without any training every time. So far, we have to say about the mobilization, we have no clue how far it's actually going to happen. There are now reports of single cases, at least single cases, where the recruitment orders have been withdrawn when they were sent to men that were supposedly being excluded from recruitment or that were incapable of being recruited. But theoretically, it's still possible that Russia is actually only recruiting 300,000. Or it's still possible that the opposition might be right and that they are actually trying to create 1 million men fresh in forces, or even more than that. 1.2 million is one of the other numbers. The reason for that is that obviously we don't really have a view about the total numbers, but it also seems that the Russians don't really seem to have a clue either. When we look at the mobilization, the complete chaos that is happening there also prevents a proper observing and a proper judgment of how many people it actually is. And where we hear of reports like Buryatia, where locally at least it looks like utter general mobilization, basically lever en masse, taking everyone in who can hold a gun and force him into the armed forces. That might be the central government abusing the Buryats as cannon fodder. It might also just be local administrators trying to overfulfill quotas to curry favor with the Kremlin. As of now, with that complete chaos, it's simply impossible to fully say how big the mobilization in total can be. And we also have the what CIA Director William Burns said, because he said 300,000 men that Russia is mobilizing. Now, if the CIA was thinking it's actually 1 million, he would probably mention it. So it might actually be only 300,000. But if those 300,000 are being recruited the way we are seeing it now, then Ukraine will get some trouble, because as I like to say, and which isn't invented by me, it's usually attributed to Mao, quantity has a quality of its own, but the quality of those troops will be miserable. Miserable, nothing short of miserable, and it'll only force the Ukrainians to spend more ammo, to say it easily. Obviously, that's quite a lot away from the truth, but soldiers that are barely trained being sent to the front line are utterly in trouble if they have to do anything more than sit in a trench and maybe point their head out and shoot at somebody attacking them. We have news from the Russian border towards the Baltics and Finland, where Russia directly is in contact with NATO. Before, there were 30,000 Russian soldiers stationed there. Now it's being reduced to 6,000. The rest is probably already in Ukraine now, which at the same time tells us how openly, blatantly open Putin is lying here. If he sees Russia as this existential threat and expects Russia, did I say Russia? I meant NATO. If Russia sees NATO as this existential threat, and if he sees Russia at war with NATO, he would probably not strip the front lines completely clean as it sees of now. So his focus is clearly on Ukraine, and he does not expect any serious attack from NATO unless his own and pure goal in that case would be to stop it with nuclear weapons. Obviously, that's some possibility in this as well. Russia also said about its regular conscription cycle. You might remember, if you've been here before, that usually on October the 1st is one of the 2 cycles for recruitment when they draw in the fresh conscripts for their draft. Russia is now postponing that by 1 month. They are now supposed to happen instead of October the 1st on 1st of November. And it can only be guessed why, but it's likely that they don't want to overextend the already stretched resources that the Russian military has to take in fresh people, because there were supposed to be 120,000 men being drafted, and they would meet 300,000, at least 300,000 mobilized reserves here, basically competing for the same trainers, for the same barracks, etc. If they only postpone it by 1 month, though, it tells us that the training they expect those reserves to be received to be probably more or less a month, if not less, especially as we're talking about 2.5 times as many. So what will be sent to Ukraine, as it looks of now, is highly doubtful if they have any serious combat value, and the equipment will also be up for the question, even though I said, as you might remember, those rusted guns we saw in some videos obviously seems to have been the typical internet thing. So from the things I read afterwards, it was supposed to be 1 or 2 boxes of those that were not properly stored, and the rest of the boxes were well stored and the guns in well shape. And those soldiers that showed us their rusted guns that didn't cycle anything, they received proper weapons right after that. So what we can see is that Russia is struggling, even training supposedly 300,000, and it seems to be rushing them to the front line fairly soon. I would not expect 300,000 under these circumstances to usher in a strategic shift in the initiative, that Russia is able to regain the full strategic initiative over especially prolonged strategic initiative if Russia actually sticks with only 300,000. But there are further informations from Russian sources, usually single Telegram channels. I found one that says that police, as well as government personnel with access to secret information, has now supposedly is banned from leaving the country, and they had to hand over their passports. How you might interpret it is with police, as this is now supposedly Russia. Police can probably just be shifted around and thus being sent for occupation duty within Ukraine, whereas before it was into a different country, which would obviously allow them some leeway within their work contract, or should at least allow them. There were the cases of the Rosgvardia units where officers refused to be sent to Ukraine, as they said their contract said they are supposed to be used in Russia. So this might be to prevent police from fleeing Russia. And when it comes to government officials with access to secret information, it indicates that Russia might actually might be afraid of people with secret access switching sites, handing over information, fleeing the country, and thus providing the Western alliance with secret information. There's also further information about the Interior Minister, I think it was, that is now having its staff train not once a month at the gun range, but weekly. What that is supposed to mean, we can obviously only guess. Whether it's supposed to mean they also might be sent into Ukraine, or whether the government is actually preparing to fight some riots, some violent uprisings. That is your guess as good as mine. But the government institutions, even though supposedly not directly involved into the war, are increasing their capabilities to fight, which is some indication of the seriousness of the situation. I have a survey from the Levada Center. Now, the Levada Center is fairly interesting because it is within Russia, but still considered to be independent, an independent survey institute. Now, obviously, there are some effects at play that might play a role. If the Levada Institute calls you and you don't trust them, you might say what you expect the government to hear. So their information might not be fully accurate because of their objects of survey might give false informations to appear in a better light. But in general, it's supposed to be one of the best sources from within Russia about how the Russian people actually think. And they published a fresh survey. According to that, 47 are worried because of the mobilizations, 13% are angry, and 11% are depressive. If we count that together, we are talking about 71% having negative emotions about the mobilization. On the other hand, 23% have answered that they feel pride for Russia due to the mobilization. Over half of the people in the survey actually said they are afraid of a general mobilization. That number has skyrocketed from the beginning of the war. And the number of people that are concerned about the situation of that war has increased from 74 to 88% within just 1 month. So up 14% within just 1 month. But at the same time, the fully unconditional support for the war has just been reduced by 2% to 44. Ukraine. As a final information, we have some interesting information about Ukraine when it comes to the conscription of their forces. Their usual fall conscription cycle that was also supposed to happen on October the 1st was postponed, and they are going to probably get them later at some point. At the same time, Zelensky signed a decree that is about the demobilization of the last year's recruits within the draft, and it's now postponed to October or November, between October and December. Now, this is kind of interesting because, first of all, it shows us that Ukraine is not interested in creating a mass army and throw warm bodies at the Russians. Otherwise, they would take the chance of drafting fresh people. They're actually not doing it, which would be an indication that their ability to use troops, to house them, to supply them, and to train them is fully used, that they can't use more. So they actually declined trying to increase their personnel in this phase of a war, which is quite a thing and quite interesting to see. The second is, which is highly surprising to me, that they actually talk about demobilization of troops that have been recruited a year ago. I have no idea how to fully grasp that and fully interpret that, because Ukraine is at war for 6-7 months now. And we should be talking about troops here that are more or less combat experienced by now, that have a high level of skill at this point. And Ukraine is talking about demobilizing them. That is very surprising in the current situation of the war, as we are not talking about a 10-year war. Obviously, at some point, if somebody survived for 10 years at the front line, he might be allowed to get home. Maybe at some point you should actually replace him and not just continue. But Ukraine is fighting for its survival, but it's actually at the same time talking about demobilizing its armed forces, which is fairly surprising here. Now, I can't fully explain this to you, why it's happening. Maybe we can find some further information at a later point, and I will talk about it in a future video. But this at least is what the information I have of now as of this. As I said, kind of surprising to me. When we come to support for Ukraine, I have the information from Le Monde, the French newspaper. It said that 6 of the 12 ordered César that were ordered by Denmark, the French government is currently negotiating with the Danish to take over half of their order, so 6 César, self-propelled howitzers. France wants to use them to hand them over to Ukraine as well, as France has already handed over or promised Ukraine 24 of those artillery systems, which is actually 1/4 of its whole of the what is it called? The stock its whole army is having. So France is actually trying to do its best to help Ukraine get proper modern artillery and is right now negotiating with the Danish government to take over that supply. And finally, I have some more information about a new theory that you might have already seen about the Nord Stream pipelines that have been blown up. And that theory, more or less, I have a German summary here, which probably is not for the majority of you. I'll just post the link here in the chat. So if you're interested in it, you can read it yourself. It basically says that the Russian did bad maintenance and it built something like ice crystals out of methane and they blew up. He takes the author. First of all, I have not checked the actual knowledge and qualifications of the author, if he's actually from that topic, if he's actually qualified to talk about it. And the next thing is that he claims that it doesn't make sense that special forces would blow up 17 hours apart. At the same time, you might wonder why a second pipeline would blow up 17 hours by negligence 17 hours later. Of course, there might be some interpretations that it was the panic after the first one that made them try to do that. But the 17 hours, for instance, are not an argument at all to me, as you have to see there was no reason to coordinate a timely attack. First of all, if you follow my theory or the theory I think is credible, that the Russians wanted to send a sign of their capabilities, in that case, it makes sense to spread it out to make sure the message actually is being received and nobody thinks it might have been a mistake. And at the same time, there was no need to. If once the thing blows up, it takes hours, if not days, for people to start looking. And whatever the means are to place explosives, if they are being sent by a mini-sub, for instance, it'll take some time to go from one pipeline to the next one. So it's perfectly reasonable that it takes some time. And if you just use timed bombs that, for instance, have a 10-hour or a 3-day timer, there's no reason to coordinate it so they blow up within seconds. So that could be an argument against it. But in the circumstance, if we want to expect that Russia might have actually done it, I don't see a reason for Russia to put up the effort to make sure it all blows up at the same time. The message might even be clearer if they don't. Nevertheless, this is another theory, so we have one more theory as a potential reason for that, for the pipelines to have blown up. And as of now, I think it is still confirmed. It's still the point of my knowledge that one of the two pipes of Nord Stream 2 is still available, and seeing it with the rest of the context that the pipelines have blown up within a week after Russian mobilization. So within a week after the Russians basically realized the severity of the situation and react by mobilizing, put some credibility to the idea that the Russians might have done it as a demonstration of their capability to NATO. And the other thing is that one of the pipes is still going. In my book, more or less excludes any serious saboteur who actually wanted to take the pipelines out for good. Because to expect them to be so incompetent that they only blow up 3 and leave the 4th one alive is stretching it. I mean, it's always possible. But that's at least not what you would expect a professional special forces team to do, that they actually leave one of the 4 pipes alive. At the same time, it still allows Russia to negotiate, and it would actually force the German government to open Nord Stream 2, which was the big political question, where Germany refused to do it, even when Nord Stream 1 was supposedly being maintained and no gas was flowing through. There were the arguments, why not use Nord Stream 2 until Nord Stream 1 is ready again? It was a matter of principle for the German government, so you could argue at least that leaving one of the 2 pipes intact would allow the Russians a victory here. As said, all of those theories are just that. They are theories, they are points, arguments, ideas of who might be responsible for that. I have not seen or heard of any serious proof from any side for any of the theories. So as of now, it's all just guesswork and people claiming something, but nobody ever showing hard proof whatsoever. So as I said jokingly, as of now, the Catholic Church might also still be a potential perp of having blown up the pipelines. That's more or it for me for now. I still have one interesting video though. It shows here where the Ukrainians are actually doing something fairly smart with their BMP-1. We see them shooting it, and as you can see the angle, this is the BMP-1, which has a 73 low pressure gun. 73 millimeter low pressure gun. That gun is more or less, you can probably expect, compare it to something like an RPG, just with a little further range. In the modern battlefield, that's close to being useless. Not completely, but in times where every IFV has automatic cannons, having this as your main armament is a serious problem. So the Ukrainians actually seem to have been smart here. As we can see, he's using a tablet, and the Ukrainians have started coordinating it with drones and their system, their Netle system, to use their BMP-1s in indirect fire, basically as artillery pieces. Interesting usage of some highly obsolete equipment, smart usage of it, which is probably a far better use than the alternative in it. Obviously, that thing can still be used for armed assaults, but if not, then that more or less useless gun can still be used as an artillery piece. Interesting video here. I'm going to take a short ad break, drink a little more, and I'll be back in a moment. So while I am fairly exhausted, to be honest, I have slept bad and some issues there, I'm not going to bother you with private problems. I'm going to do some within the question and answers, but yeah, I have to apologize. 2 hours will be fairly impossible for me now, as we are actually already over 1 hour already of further permanent talking here. So let's see what I can do here. If it has worked. Nope. The bot seems to be dead. Okay. Let me try myself. Okay. Bot is dead. I'm sorry. The mods, have you found some questions in there? If so, then please ask a few questions with hashtag question. I'll just answer 3 to 5 and then we'll call it a day for now. As said, I'm not in the best shape, and the bot has decided to die as of now. So I have one question here. I also saw that Poland took possession of Gazprom office building and some inventory, because Gazprom don't supply gas. So maybe it was the Polish army. I think there is a 10+ theory. You can claim whoever it was. To be perfectly honest, all the thing we say is you can come with the usual conspiracy head thing, cui bono, and we can find almost everyone to have a reason to do that. German government, US government, Ukrainian government, Polish government, British, a lot of additional NATO nations. I see I see now the theory of it blowing up by accident, and I see the Russian government having reason for it too. We need to honestly say, as of now, the best we can do is present a theory and think who might be responsible. Obviously, if you are on the pro-Russian side, or if you really dislike America, then you will take Biden's speech from, what was it, February 6th, where he was in a press conference with the German chancellor and said, if Russia invades, then Nord Stream 2 is finished. Then you take this as a proof that the Americans blew it up. I don't try to be too political here, and I don't want to diss anyone who has voted for Biden, but to be perfectly honest, I think sometimes that Biden is an old man who maybe should deserve his retirement. Was that polite enough to say? Was it polite enough how I said it? So what he says, I don't really take too serious in all detail. As said, I really try to be polite here and be as little offensive as possible when it comes to political affiliations here. But in this regard, I don't take him too serious when he says something like this. And we shouldn't forget that America has a lot of soft power when it comes to political pressure or to economic pressure. That doesn't mean they sent the Navy SEALs to blow up a pipeline that is run by some allied nation, which is basically an act of war. So, yeah. I would expect the Tartars to immediately surrender once they go to Kherson front. How bad would that be? The question is, how are the units set up? If they are intermixed, then you always have the problems that surrendering isn't that easy. A lot of soldiers might consider surrendering, but if that means that your comrades shoot you in the back, or that the likelihood of the comrades, I mean, the moment you basically go out of the trench with your hands up, when you think that you have 100% chance of your friends, of your comrades shooting you in the back, then you are 100% dead. Whereas if you stay within the unit, you might survive. And then it's a pure questioning how serious people, Russian soldiers who want to capitulate, who want to switch sides because they might be forced recruits like Ukrainian citizens, how bad they see the chances of doing each side. Because when we can see that the so-called People's Republics basically cleaned out their territory of fighting-aged males, a lot of them surely didn't want to fight, but there weren't any big mass capitulations. So in this context, it has to be said, it has to be seen, and there are actually ways to prevent capitulations like this in the military, and it wouldn't be the first time. Now, of course, you would expect the Tartars to switch sides as soon as they can, but the question is, can they? That's unfortunately not that easy to answer. Tits Saul, thank you for the support. In my opinion, best should we have ramped up ammo manufacturing. Have you seen any signs of it happening? Yes, there are some signs. I think the production of Stinger is supposed to rise up. They have to retool, so it's going to take a couple of years. Javelin, I think, is supposedly going up. HIMARS is already confirmed to go up. HIMARS missiles, the production, and we know that several of the factories in Europe are now producing 152 grenades to supply Ukraine. So the ammo production seems to be going up. When it comes to anything else, though, I have not seen any proof that, for instance, the IFV production, tank production, or something like this is going up in anticipation of deliveries to Ukraine, which obviously would also be needed. What option does Belarus have to assist Russia? The most loyal troops, I think, security police. How many security police troops does Lukashenko have? Unfortunately, I can't really answer that. I would have to look it up, and so could you yourself. Supposedly, the paratroops are the most loyal here. That's what I read. But when it comes to the total number, he asked Russian troops for help, which shows that his army, which in theory should be strong enough, was not willing to support Lukashenko on its own, was not willing to crush the uprising against him in strength. All of this would be indication, as soon as the Russian support is considered to be gone, that there might be a window of opportunity for the Belarusian opposition. But that's, as I said, like, my knowledge of that has to be called somewhat limited. I am going to, I'm getting called, and the cat cam somehow again doesn't work. Why doesn't it work here? Because I hear people complaining about not seeing the cat. There he is. There you have him. Peaceful as always, until he starts his destruction, his path of destruction. You sweet boy. Good. I don't see much more questions, and I'm actually... Oh, no, I see something here. Okay. Could it be possible to supply Ukraine with T-72 bought from African country in exchange for better Western tank or equipment? In theory, yes, but those countries have to be willing to basically break relations with Russia, and that's more or less the problem. There are tons of countries having a lot of Russian-made equipment. And some of them actually have fairly good relationships with the West. Like India is now buying weapons from the US. The Indian government in general is considered to have fairly warm relationships with the Western democracies. But at the same time, they also hold warm relationships with Russia, and their whole defense is dependent on Russian support when it comes to keeping their gear running. Other than that, they would have several thousand T-72s and T-90s to hand over. But it's highly unlikely. So a country doing that, selling weapons for to any Western country, to the US or whatever, to hand it to Ukraine, knows what he's doing, knows that the country is committing a hostile act towards Russia, and Russia will respond in kind and will react in accordance to punish the nation for it when it comes to future aid, whether it be within the Security Council, whether it will be about weapons, and which country is willing to take that unless it's already deeply seated within the Western sphere of influence. So I would not be too hopeful to do that. There were some rumors of like Egypt selling something, but I think the majority of those are probably just rumors as that. I can hardly imagine a country within reach with decent weaponry that is willing to, at this point, give up fully its relationship with Russia, as it's a two-edged sword. Russia, the advantage of Russia was always that its armaments were A, affordable, and B, came more or less without strings. Western equipment always comes with strings. The West will stop supplying you with spare parts if you do a military coup, if you attack your neighbor, if you crush unrest with your tanks. Russia is far less hesitant when it comes to this, when it comes to supporting a country. So it's basically a strategic long-term choice if you switch from Russian equipment that is affordable and comes without much political baggage to Western equipment that might be well made, might be better, but is far more expensive and comes with a lot of political baggage. So I don't see much hope for it to actually be successful. Ukraine reconquering will be counterproductive in the long term, oversized. So why do they keep letting the best equipped troop escape? It makes no sense if they really want to retake and hold. Yeah, there were rumors that supposedly there was a green corridor, but you see that they don't let them escape when they can avoid that. Now, I usually say that in military, it's one of the most challenging tasks. I should first respond to Gerhard Humphrey. Thank you very much for the support. Do you see Belarus getting involved militarily in the conflict at all in the near future? I can't imagine it. I simply can't imagine, because Lukashenko's position is far too weak and his military supposedly sees no point in getting involved. So I don't see a way for that. Thank you very much for your support. It seems highly unlikely that they act as more as in fleet in being. That's probably the biggest support that Putin can hope for. That the Belarusians move some troops south to threaten to scare the Ukrainians and force them to gain some reinforcements. So to come back to the reconquering, I usually say that one of the most challenging tasks is to conduct an orderly withdrawal when you are in contact with the enemy. But the Russians have achieved that several times. But you can say, well, have they? Here in Kiev, the Ukrainians were counterattacking, but the Russians withdrew and the Ukrainians didn't charge after them. They slowly inched forwards to see for traps whether the Russians are still there. What we have here seems to be that the Russians actually got out and didn't have to fight their way out. So there might have been false informations here. They were claiming a cauldron, but maybe it was already more or less evacuated there. There are some rumors, some claims, it might have been a green corridor, so that there have been some agreements, but it doesn't seem likely. In the one time, the Ukrainians actually had mechanized forces and the initiative and the will and the speed to push forward. We see that the Russians more or less handed them the equipment for a whole brigade here in Izium. So it seems they simply weren't there yet. The Russians, it actually seems that the Russians were able to withdraw in time, because if they haven't, then you are completely right. It should not have happened. I said it from the beginning, basically after, I don't know when I said it first on my German channel, probably 2 weeks into the war, maybe 4 weeks, but no later than that I don't think this war will be decided by capturing territory. It will be decided by the destruction of units. There's nothing close to being lost from either side, close, I mean, that will decide the outcome of the war. Kherson is a big issue, but it's far from being recaptured soon, and B, it would also in itself, it would be a strategic defeat, but it would not be the loss of the war for Russia. None of this means by itself that the war is over. What would mean is when those 300,000 Russia is currently recruiting are being destroyed within 3 months or 2 months. And the Russians are back at 150,000 men, and there are 200,000 Russian soldiers in prisoner of war camps calling their family at home and telling them how well treated they are and that it's not that bad and that this war is really bad for Russia. That's a far bigger issue than whether or not Severodonetsk is being recaptured in 4 weeks or not. So you're perfectly right. They shouldn't let them escape. If there was actually a deal between the Russians and the Ukrainians, it would be questionable. I mean, the situation on the ground might dictate it. I cannot really say that. I should not judge them without having seen the actual order of battle from both sides, the actual situation. They should have their reasonings to do that, but I agree that it sounds like a bad idea. Cheryl de Rue, thank you very much for your support should be New Zealand. Thank you very much. Do we know if Russia has good defensive lines at Kremina, Svatove, or is there a risk of breakthrough like after Balaklia? They should not have strong ones. Kremina was taken basically when they were about to push towards Severodonetsk. None of it is here close to the old contact line. And none of it is under threat by the Ukrainians for months. Now, Kherson, that front line is more or less stable for 4 months, 5 months. And the Russians decided that they're going to focus on Donbass. So it made perfect sense for the Russians to start digging in. And then once they were done, to start digging in the next line. That made perfect sense. But here, I mean, 2 weeks ago, or how long is it ago? Is it 3 weeks already? The Ukrainians were, what did you say? Svatove, right? Yeah. 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, the Ukrainians were 90 kilometers away. You don't dig trenches there. There's absolutely no point. Now, will they dig trenches now? Yes, of course they will. But it's not going to be anywhere close to how it's like in Kherson or how it is here along the contact line. Is there a breakthrough possible? It is, but it's unlikely. I would not expect it because then again, Ukrainian potential is limited by the amount of weaponry they have. A lot of their troops are light infantry, which is not for the breakthrough, but can be fairly useful in using the breakthrough, but not for achieving it by itself. What the Ukrainians had here was the element of surprise, and that is one of the most powerful things in military. If you completely achieve a complete surprise of your opponent, and that obviously that time has long passed. Now the Russians know they are under attack here, so the surprise is no longer up for the question. Is the US embassy open in Ukraine? A missile in the proximity of the embassy could invoke Article 5 or just saber rattling? As far as I know, they actually reopened it. I think so. At least several embassies are open again, or a lot of them. I don't think it's Article 5. It's the territory. I know it's embassy is extraterritorial, so supposedly it's the territory of a home country, but I don't see this to justify Article 5, as it's not an attack on the US itself, it's just an attack on an embassy. So I would not guess that this would find support when it comes to Article 5. Again, unless, of course, the NATO would come to a point that it actually wants war and is just looking for an excuse. But I think we're far away from that. What do you think of USAF F-35 flying over Belarus to Romania with transponders off? Is that supposed to have happened? I would say it did not. and over Belarus to Romania. So down here. I doubt that would happen because again, you don't fly through Belarus unless you want a fight, and I don't see the US at that point yet where they actually try to engage into the war and find a provocation. So neither do I think it's a good idea, nor do I think it actually happened if that is somehow claimed somewhere, which I have not read, to be honest. New Year, do you think the SPD will eventually allow?
Please.
Will eventually allow the Leopard 2 to Ukraine, or do you have any explanation for the behavior other than being corrupted by Russian influence? If other nations supply Western tanks, they will have no choice, I think. The public opinion is putting so much pressure on them that they try to use that. We would be the first to supply Western tanks, and we can't do that. They use that as an excuse, and you have to say that they're them giving military equipment to other nations who then give tanks to Ukraine is not that bad idea, actually. It's not that sexy. It's not that great for PR, but Ukraine probably rather has T-72 now than Leopard 2s, even though Leopard 2s might be better because they don't have issues with maintenance, with training, with everything that comes with Leopard 2s. T-72s, they know how to handle, they know how to maintain, they have the spare parts. Once there are deliveries from Western tanks to Ukraine, the internal pressure on the SPD will probably be so big that they have no choice but to give in as well. That's at least what I would expect. Then we might see Leopard 1s from the industry reaching Ukraine, and then we might see some talks within the Leopard 2 nations within NATO, how to best supply Ukraine without weakening yourself too much. Because unlike the M1 Abrams, of which there are a couple of thousand in reserves, the numbers for Leopard 2s to spare that are basically can be handed over without weakening armed forces is actually fairly limited. It was on MSNBC news about F-35 going to Romania. I just don't know what Romania has to do with any of this. Going to Romania might be, but not through Belarus. That's the point. Romania is within NATO. So if Romania feels like it's threatened from Russia, it's perfectly fine to send some F-35s there, either from some other allied nation or from the US. So that's not really spectacular, as Romania is part of NATO. Yeah, must be nice to just do nothing and be loved. Ukraine don't need to push in Kherson. They can just keep up Russian stock there with limited supplies if the Russians actually have supply issues. And as said, unless we expect the Russians to be morons, and supposedly Putin had influence here, maybe he ordered them to send in reinforcements. And they said, but we can't with supplies. And he said, I don't care, send the reinforcements. That's a theoretic possibility, actually. But if we don't assume that, then we need to assume that their supply situation is actually fairly stable. Otherwise, they wouldn't send reinforcements. You don't put more mouth into a house or into a region where the people are already starving. You rather take some out. And that actually can increase the efficiency when you have less people, but they are better supplied. Basically, the principle of professional armies towards conscript army, it's more or less the same. So as they send reinforcements there, at least the assumption could be that they actually don't have that big supply issues. So Ukraine won't be able to starve them out. If they can't starve them out, then the only chance is to defeat them somewhere else, or actually to grind through no matter the cost. And whether they are willing to take those losses is obviously still up for the question. After Lima, next stop is Kremina. Ukraine is almost at Kremina. Then big push to Statove. Well, Kremina is obviously the next target, but I don't see this in some... you mean Svatove, I guess. I don't see this in itself being a game changer. Sure, it cuts the line of communication to Severodonetsk, but it can still be supplied from the south and the east. But yeah, Svatove is a much bigger target, a much juicier target, as it would cut the supply, more or less every supply that comes here from Belgorod down. This is one of the main communication hubs, transport hubs. And once they actually reach Starobilsk, that would be a fairly nice win for them when it comes to the supply of Luhansk down from the north. But then again, we should almost always not forget that those two so-called People's Republic were still able to field armed forces and host Russian troops before the war began. So the lines of communication to the east from those two so-called People's Republic were obviously sufficient enough. Just cutting them to the north or to the south should not change much inside of those regions. I have to take a quick ad break to drink some more. Turkey is in talks to join the SCO. If Turkey leaves NATO, would they have to return Western military equipment? No, they wouldn't. They bought it legally. Unless there is some weird contract in it that in this case they have to return it. I don't see a reason why they would have to return it, obviously. And then we come back to the issue of buying Western equipment. If they do join an actual alliance, and the SCO is not an alliance. It supposedly has some military component, but that's a different story I'm coming to quite after that. But if you buy military equipment, Western military equipment, and you join a hostile alliance, you don't get your spare parts anymore. Venezuela has F-16s. When have they last received spare parts for them? I don't know, but I doubt they are well equipped with spare parts anymore. So that's another argument why switching T-72s for Western tanks from other nations isn't that great of an idea. And now back to the SCO. A so-called military alliance that has Pakistan, India, and China in it cannot be too effective when it comes to actually exercising power. There are some hostile nations, some nations that consider each other an enemy, that have open territorial disputes with regular firefights. Those aren't very good military alliances. So the SCO is like a nice club with some economic talk and an attempt to build a counterweight, but I don't take it too serious. It might have some benefit when it fits everyone's interest, when there's like a radical Islamic uprising somewhere, then maybe they will find together and find a solution. If there's another tsunami, they will probably work together. But when it comes to proper hard military alliance, I think the SCO is more or less toothless. Does Thorsten think Putin has gone full Hitler and is trying to run the military? I don't think it yet, but I said in the past, it's fairly normal for politicians to intervene in military affairs because both sides have different interests and different priorities. And we could see that here. This is like one of the best examples. I would expect the Ukrainian military to say we should more or less like take this line here and maybe a little further to the east and then turn south. We should not expose ourselves too much. So not like take the whole front line, because you can see how much you would expose yourself if I'm not going to measure that, but that's like a couple of 100 kilometers, 300 kilometers or something like this. Whereas if you do it like this, you might get away with 150 kilometers of front line. So militarily, it would likely make a lot of sense to basically take this line here. And obviously, you have to extend it to the side to get some territory to trade in case of an attack. But I don't see a military reason in a military sense at this phase to try to reach Markivka or here the Russian border. And then the politicians play a role because Zelensky has to explain to his constituency, to the international audience, to every Ukrainian, why he would give up Ukrainian citizens to the to the torture chambers of the Russians in the east of this area, in the east of Luhansk, while he has the military means to liberate them. And there are people likely going to be tortured, likely going to be killed, if that part is going to be occupied for another year by the Russians. And in the current phase, he might be able to liberate them within 5 months or something like this. And at that point, the politician Zelensky might order the military to liberate all of this, to liberate those civilians. Militarily, it's a disaster. But from a political point, it has a reason. And these are things that sound far less spectacular, sound far more spectacular than they are in reality. In World War II, in 1941, the Wehrmacht wanted to focus on Moscow. Hitler said that the cornfields, the wheat fields of Ukraine are far more important to be secured, to make sure that the Wehrmacht, the German population, doesn't starve by securing them. So he ordered troops away from the Army Group Center to Army Group South to concentrate on capturing Ukraine, to get those wheat fields under German control before the harvest is done. And after that, only after that, he sent them back to Army Group Center to push towards Moscow. Now, there are a lot of people claiming that this would have changed the war, that this lost the war, that Moscow wasn't taken more early. This was actually a topic of my final exams too, and I disagree with that highly. There are far bigger reasons why the war was lost than the question whether or not the attack on Moscow was fast enough. And even if Moscow had been taken, I don't see that the war would have been won at that phase. But the political decision that he said we need the wheat fields more than we need the transport hub of Moscow and the capital and the prestige of it. That's a reasonable decision in this context. And from this point here, from a military standpoint, that would, in a point of weakness where the Ukrainian side has the initiative, it makes perfect sense evacuating the right bank of the Dnieper River, withdrawing all their troops to the other side, shortening the front line, by allowing to reinforce them, make them stronger, as the Dnieper would be the border that is more or less impossible for the Ukrainians to cross in force. So the Russians would be safe along that line. They could create reserves that could have helped up here, stopping the Ukrainians, that could have allowed for counterattacks in other positions. Perfectly reasonable military thinking. The political thinking is Kherson is the only capital of an oblast that I captured, Putin. So it's a highly political price. I can't hand that back to the Ukrainians. Secondly, once I give Kherson up, the same thing that allows my army to shorten the front line and to create reserves, the difficulty of crossing over the Dnieper, that same issue is applying the different way too. Once the Russians give up the right bank, they can't return reasonably anymore. So Mykolaiv is out of the question, and with that, Odessa is out of the question. And as his political goals are the subjugation of Ukraine, this will only be possible if Russia controls the Black Sea coast, because as long as Ukraine has serious harbors, they can export. They have big production in resources and especially in food. Wheat, other stuff, and that can be transported by train and by truck, but the transport costs are ludicrous in comparison to ships. So if Russia controls the coast, they have Ukraine in their stranglehold. They can dictate whatever Ukraine is going to lead to the future. And if you want to control Ukraine, you need to make sure they lose their harbors, especially Odessa, for good. So he cannot give up Kherson unless he basically accepts that he's going to lose his whole strategic goals for the war, and that's why he's interfering here. So you can say that going full Hitler, and obviously, for instance, Hitler's ideas. I mean, in summer 41, you could argue that it actually wasn't that bad an idea to turn south towards the Ukraine to conquer it. But obviously in 44, for instance, the collapse of Army Group Center is more or less to a huge part, if not completely, Hitler's achievement. So while he might have had one right idea, that doesn't mean I want to in some way justify his usual meddling. But what you see here is the reason why, and it's justified. If you think about the political goals, a military usually, especially a military that is not deeply educated in all various things that, like in all questions of society and social sciences, etc., thinks more or less in military terms. And in military terms, evacuating the right bank is perfectly sane. In political terms, it's almost suicide. And that's the same issue here. And we might actually see Ukraine's government intervening in that regard as well. Exactly the same issue here. News where suggestions move was a hint for Belarus to keep out of it and not even think about using their jets for Russian nukes or other weapons. Thank for your work on this channel. So I have missed that, but okay, it's quite possible that it happened. Even though I would, I mean, okay, maybe the media reported it. I would have not expected they actually fly over Belarusian territory, especially in this situation. It's so possible that the Belarusians try to shoot them down. I mean, hostile foreign planes in this current situation in your airspace, you would attack them. That makes perfect sense. And that could start a shooting war. So I have no idea where that information comes from and how reasonable that is. But even if MSNBC reports it, I'm still doubtful that this actually happens. I'm sorry. If it happens, yeah, okay, that's an explanation for it. But the risks involved of it, I don't know if it actually happens. I would not say it was actually a smart move. I would be doubtful. How likely do you think the Russians are faking not having supply issues in Kherson by sending more reinforcements like Finland did with Russia in the end of the Winter War? I think it's highly unlikely. That's a little too much of it. What could in theory be possible that either they had so many losses that they are just replacing it, and as they already have lost 5,000 people, then sending 2,000 new ones is still a reduction of 3,000. That could be one option. A second option could be that at the same time they're withdrawing other units to be refreshed. That's another option. So they're actually not increasing the numbers. And while we have reports about fresh troops arriving, we miss the reports of other troops moving away. Also a fair possibility. But that they fake it to some degree, I don't think it's likely. A German naval officer warns about the increasing development of Russian ships and naval weapons, begging for budget or real threat. I think he's actually the commander of the German Navy. So telling him that he's saying nonsense would be kind of, let's say it optimistic, self-confident, right? Now, Russia has big, ambitious plans all the time. Don't forget about all the plans about building new aircraft carriers in the last 10 years, more or less. I honestly am doubtful that they will continue their naval building plan within the next 2 years. The economic strains they have with this war and now mobilization, manpower and intellectual, like basically brain drain happening right now while manpower is leaving. Like, so there are supposedly several 100,000 young men having left the country. They are not just fighting age, they are working age as well. Then, even if it's just 300,000, I'm pretty sure 90% of those were not unemployed before. So they are taking them out of the workforce. That's less taxes and more money spent on the military. The losses they're suffering, the embargoes, all the financial trouble that they can actually keep up their naval production is doubtful, especially as resources they pour into the Navy, while being at a land war where they suffer heavy casualties. I mean, never say no. The Russians might always surprise you with another stupid decision. And what is it? Never stop your enemy from making a mistake? So maybe they are doing this, but it would be insanity to keep up a big naval program, even if they can do it in the situation they're currently at. So I'm actually not too worried about that for those reasons. Cowboy Bob, thank you very much for your support. Betting odds on Ukraine storming through Kremsvatove, Strabolisk faster than they took Liman. I don't expect them. Betting odds. So you mean within a week, basically reaching this year? No, I don't think so. First of all, the Russians are now pouring in reserves and freshly mobilized men. And while they are more or less useful in offensive operations, in defense, once they're in a trench where they just have to point their rifle towards the opponent, they should more or less do their job. It shouldn't be such a disaster. And at the same time, the Ukraine doesn't have the advantage of surprise, the element of surprise anymore. So betting odds, I guess you want me a quota, 25-1, more or less. So I don't think it's anywhere we can expect any breakthrough like this anymore. And you can always punch through a front line, but to keep going and to roll up the opponent, you need enough mobile armored forces. And does Ukraine actually have those? And is Ukraine willing to commit those? Those are big questions. Shouldn't the Rasputitsa be no problem in the south and east, like it wasn't in the spring for the Russians? I think it wasn't it more in the north? Rasputitsa in general, I think, is an issue. It's obviously different per location, per ground. Maybe it's less in hills when the water is less likely to be sucked up in the ground or something like this. But to be honest, that's not really something I know too much in detail. I've heard that the water supply for Crimea is supplied from Kherson area. Do you know if it's true? And if so, would this affect military strategy in the area? There is a canal here from the Novakhovka dam, and you see it here. And it's going here into Crimea. That's the so-called Crimean Canal. Crimea is an arid region. It doesn't have enough water to do the farming they do here. So that canal is needed to do farming. The people there don't die of lack of water. They don't, what is it called? I forgot the word. It's getting late. So they are not going to die if that channel is not here. The agriculture will suffer and stop. In military terms, it was important for the Russians to conquer Novakhovka, to blow up the dam the Ukrainians built here to stop the water from flowing down the canal. As this is a big economic burden for Crimea, as all that agricultural land here was basically barren, wasn't able to be used. But from military terms, I don't think it's a big issue. It's an economic issue midterm, but and thus it's important to keep Crimea productive. But for military terms, I don't see the big issue. The dehydration, yeah. Dehydration. The soldiers there won't die of dehydration because of the canal not working. Do you see Putin intends on putting 600 billions into the Russian military and police force over the next 3 years to modernize it, mate? Putin will wait. What is wait? Okay, for the CCP to invade Taiwan. 600 billion of what? His foreign reserves are either used up fairly soon or frozen. And his local money he can print. But then again, you need to ask what is going to happen with that money. I don't think he's going to run out of money too soon internally. But what can he buy with that? The factories can't produce without spare parts. And rubles aren't really accepted by most of his suppliers. So I don't see him pouring that into it, especially within the next 3 years, to modernize the army in any reasonable and measurable way while they are suffering high losses. The quality of the material of the Russian armed forces is going to decrease during that conflict because they increasingly have to go to the depots as their production can't keep up with the losses. So while they might still be able to pour out some new T-90M, despite the initial reports that Uralvagonzavod was stopping its production, they seem to still be producing. At least there are some propaganda reels from the Russian. If we believe them, they are still producing. Those production cannot keep up with the losses, which means they have to go to the depots where the older stuff is. So the quality of the Russian armed forces is decreasing, it's not increasing, no matter what he says and no matter how much money he wants to pay. I don't see this to be solved anytime soon, and especially not fast. Do you think Putin will resort to nuclear when all conventional means have failed or disappear, using his billions to buy permanent invisibility? I don't think he can ever disappear. If he leaves Russia, he's in threat of either being killed by assassins as soon as he's no longer the president, or being abducted or outright arrested and deported to either Den Haag, or to Ukraine. So he's going to stay in Russia, and he's going to try staying in the Kremlin to avoid being put on trial in Russia as well. So I don't see him disappearing. Now, when it comes to nuclear weapon, who knows? Supposedly Ukraine is taking it serious. There are a lot of arguments against it. It would be kind of suicide, political suicide for Russia, as even its most loyal or supporters, or at least those nations that are still friendly despite everything, would turn their backs on Russia, most likely. But you never really know when it comes to someone like him and his desperation. Follow-up betting odds retakes Crimea by 10. That's October 1st, I guess, in the US calendar. So by October 1st, 2023, so within 1 year. Well, if we believe Ben Hodges, you should have better chances of taking it than not, if we believe Ben Hodges. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. That's not just any Ben Hodges. I can't imagine it. To be honest, I'm happy if Ukraine manages to surprise me and actually takes it, but I'm still highly doubtful that it goes this easily and this fast. So maybe 15-1 or 1-15, depending on it. Yeah, Shark. Sweet boy. Do you think that we had that? How far do you suspect the offensive will reach in Kharkiv, and what strategic cities could be captured before winter and mostly stalled fighting? I think in winter fighting can continue. Rasputitsa should cool it down a little bit. Depending on snow, obviously, and things like that. I mean, if they get the worst winter in decades and have 5 meters of fresh snow, then I think that any fighting will more or less stop. Whereas if it's just cold enough to freeze over, or maybe even cold enough that rivers can be crossed with tanks, all of this takes it completely. But I think where it will reach in Kharkiv before winter, I mean, Svatove isn't that crazy far away anymore. We're talking about 30 kilometers. That can be achieved still till winter. Svatove is definitely within reach. That doesn't mean they are capturing it. Starobilsk is a little different. We see several ridge lines among that. It's through hilly terrain, so it offers a lot of advantages to the defender. Whether they reach that, I would be much more doubtful. But the strategic goals should probably be Starobilsk, because then you have lines of communication south through Luhansk. And if you want to recapture Luhansk Oblast and the so-called Luhansk People's Republic, you should have a wider access to the area to be able to shift your troops around, to pounce on the front line to find weak points. If you're just reaching it like here, trying to push through here will be far more difficult than if you have a longer area to choose from where to attack, and where you can interdict troops advancing on other positions. Like if they are here along the line and they are attacking here and reinforcements are moving in that direction, they have a chance of interdicting those. So I would expect the goal on this offensive to end more or less towards the east when they reach Starobilsk. Starobilsk, yes. That I think. Obviously, they should widen it a little further to the east, but when it comes to bigger points, that seems a very good point. Putin turns 70 on October 7th next week. Will he see his 71st birthday? Well, that's not really. Now we're increasingly reaching points where it's pure guesswork. That's not really my strong suit. I try to be more the analyst than the guy looking into his, what is it called, the glass bowl, like the seer. Will he see? I would generally expect yes, but that's more or less it. I'm going to take a quick ad break and then I'm going to ask 2 more questions and then my throat will get some rest. We are closing in on 2 hours anyways, so I'll be right back. Yes, as you can see, crystal ball is the right word. You are perfectly right. And as you can see, I am getting tired and my vocabulary is shrinking ever further. So maybe I should really stop it fairly soon. Do you think that Russia has the logistic capacity to equip their troops with winter gear during winter? Let's expect it. Let's put it this way. I can tell you a lot of people already on Twitter writing their threats that they're all going to freeze to death this winter. It's a possibility. It's a possibility that they have the winter gear on stock, but they never took care of it and rats ate everything. So they can't use it anymore. Or they just supply it anyways, even though it has holes everywhere. That's all a possibility. But we should not underestimate them just yet. Let's just expect that they all will have winter gear. If they don't, we can still continue further and see what can be done with that and maybe mock them about this. That Russia is getting surprised by the Russian winter. But that already, saying this should already tell the tale. Like the Russians should know what they are needing, what they need. Now, will they be able to supply that in the current situation? They surely will have some issues, but I would not expect them to fail this. Okay. Yeah, I guess we are more or less coming to an end. So in this case, I want to use the opportunity to thank you all for being here. Thank you all for the support I'm getting. Thank you for the donations today. It's very much appreciated. This channel is only possible because of donations like from viewers like you. So thank you very much for everyone to allow me to keep doing this. If you also want to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Other than that, there are other ways to support without financial means, obviously, as well, and that is by helping me to grow the channel. That is of a very big help as well, and I see some here that are actually here from the German channel still up at 4 in the morning or something just to support me building the English channel, which is an insane support that I receive, which is really, really appreciated. So if you want to support the channel, you can donate, obviously, and it's extremely appreciated. But if you don't have the means or you don't want to, there's still tons of ways to help me. One of that would be to share the channel, to help it grow, to recommend it to others. This, what I do, it seems to be fairly different to what you usually see here. What I see, most of the channels are like deeply pro-Ukrainian, that in my book, they feel more like propaganda channels, pro-Ukrainian propaganda channels. Whereas if you follow me here, you know that I try to keep the objectivity, which is unpleasant to some viewers now and then if I speculate that actually a war crime might have been done by the Ukrainians as well. Usually they aren't. I also say that when it comes to the volume of war crimes, one side is the clear leader in this, and that is not Ukraine. But the fact I try to stick to the facts as close as I can, and just because one side claims something, that doesn't mean it's automatically that. So while that is appreciated by a lot of people, if you don't do things like that, if you just blame the Russians all the time and call them orcs, this is not how I run this channel. It's more dry, more boring, less emotional, but I hope it's better. At least that's what I aim for. So if you appreciate it, I would very much invite you to subscribe to the channel. And obviously, I would love you to recommend it to others to help the channel grow. Don't forget the bell button if you have subscribed so you don't miss future videos. Giving a thumbs up shows the algorithm that this channel, that those videos here are good. So it actually helps me a lot too. And every comment you make is also great for the algorithm and thus helps me too. And obviously you can have your discussions among each other. I'm more or less staying out of it increasingly as this can be pretty wild within the comment sections. But you don't see, there's no reason for you to hold back. I hope you enjoyed it. I will very likely be back with the next live stream today in 1 week. So next Saturday, but you can expect the next situation report from me on Tuesday and another one on Thursday. And other than that, there will likely be smaller, there might be a video or two in between with other topics or about other developments that we've seen. And at this point, I also want to thank Jamif. Thank you very much for your support as well. So thank you very much to everyone who supported this today. Thank you for being here today. And I hope to see you soon. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe. If you're still here, then you obviously like it or hate it so much that you can't get away from it and still watch me. So please subscribe. See you soon. And don't forget, I'll be back.